Welcome to Midlife Matters. I'm Marie, and each week I'm joined by my friends Julie and Mindy to talk about all the topics keeping women in the middle years up at night. Sometimes midlife calls for a career change, and today we're showcasing a friend of ours who did just that. Kate's story is one of faith and perseverance as she pursued more education and the job of her dreams. Let's get started. Hi, Mindy.
Hey, Marie.
Hi, Julie.
Hey, Marie.
Today we're going to be starting a series of interviews with a friend who's made a big change in midlife. We thought that it might be fun to periodically showcase some of the ways women reinvent themselves or the circumstances around them in the middle years. So today's guest is Kate Watkins, a friend of Julie's, who went back to school to get her master's and then her doctorate, and now works as an assistant professor at a university here in Nashville. Kate, welcome to Midlife Matters.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We're so excited to hear your story, and I'm going to let Julie do a little bit more in-depth introduction.
I first knew Kate as a stay-at-home homeschool mom. We met probably 13 years ago at a homeschool tutorial that we were part of here in Nashville. And her oldest two children were friends with my oldest two. And our kids spent a lot of time together during those high school years. And I remember the Watkins home in Franklin has always had an open door policy, complete with a swimming pool and even an actual wiffle ball field on their property.
Wow.
So they were the fun family. Not even sure I knew this about you, Kate, until I read your bio, but you also had an elementary education degree and had taught school for a few years before your first child was born in 1991. Then, sometime during those homeschooling years, when her kids were young teenagers, she completed her master's degree of divinity. I think that was 2008, and then went on to earn her doctorate of ministry in 2014. That was all over about a 10-year period. And I remember thinking, wow, she must be superwoman or something to still have enough mental energy to study so much, do research, write papers, all in that stage of life, all while educating her own kids at home and working with her husband, Larry, in their counseling business. So needless to say, Kate has had a lot of major life changes in the form of career change in midlife, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Like Marie said, she's currently an assistant Bible faculty at Lipscomb University, and she's involved in some exciting things that we'll talk about later in the interview.
That's awesome, Kate.
Well, I'm laughing that Julie said I must be superwoman. I really think that the way to describe me is I'm just really tired. I think that would be the best thing to say. But it has been interesting to sort of watch God move some pieces around and do some things differently than I had thought that they would be done. So yeah, I'm eager to answer some questions.
Go back to the time before you started your master's. You were homeschooling with two children. What got you thinking about this new path in life? Like, what motivated you to make such a huge transformation? Did you wrestle with the idea, or was it just like, yes, this is what I'm going to do, and it was easy? What was going on in your mind?
You know, I look back at that time and I've said before to my husband how gracious God was that I did not know the amount of work that was going to be required for what I felt like was stirring inside of me, because I'm confident that if I knew, I would have said no. I remember as a 13-year-old, I had been a candy striper, and the role of a candy striper literally is to walk up and down the halls of the hospital and offer cups of cold water. At that time, you would take the newspaper in or drop off flowers. And there was something about just being present for people as they were in the hospital that always was a beautiful memory for me. I always loved that. And I'd gone on and gotten my elementary education degree and taught for a couple of years. But then I realized that there was something in the hospital that was called a chaplain. And in my mind, the role of a chaplain was simply a more educated way to pass out cups of cold water and to get to pray for people and to be present for people when they were going through a really hard time. And I remember Googling, what do you have to be a chaplain? I just remember saying, I think at some point in life, I want to be a chaplain. So I Googled, you needed to have a master's of divinity to be a chaplain. And I said, Larry, I think I want to go and get my master's of divinity. And he said, well, fine, we'll do whatever you need to do. He had gone back. He had a 25-year span in education, and he had gone back midlife and gotten his master's. I knew that it would work where I could do night classes, or he would be able to step away from counseling to be able to watch the kids on the days that I needed to be in class. I took a very slow path to do it, but there really wasn't a lot of grappling with how are we going to make this work. It was just a real sense of, I want to be a chaplain. What do I have to do to make it happen? And the good news was I knew no one who had a master's of divinity. So no one could say, oh, you're going to have to study Greek and you're going to have to do Hebrew and you're going to have to be spending all types of hours doing this crazy stuff. I just thought that if I wanted to be a chaplain, that's what I had to do. And so I did it.
Wow.
I definitely think that sometimes ignorance
Now,
is
I'm not
really
a chaplain.
bliss.
Would you like to know that?
Oh, that's right.
I'm not a chaplain.
Well, I think a lot of us might think we want to be something, but we don't always just go out and do it.
It's true.
I often say to my students, you've got to trust your spiritual instincts. And sometimes I often say I've loved God long enough to know that when I'm getting pulled in that direction, I can pay attention to it now or I can pay attention to it later. So it's easier to be quickly obedient when you know that eventually you're going to have to say yes anyway. And so I think that's where I was at that point. Now, it did not mean, I have very specific memories of one night in particular. It was 2:00 in the morning. And for those of you who haven't studied Greek, there's 24 different ways to write the Greek word thee. Okay, we have one way to write the Greek word thee. 2:00 in the morning, I'm up memorizing the 24 ways to write the Greek word thee. And I know at 8:00 in the morning, I have another class and I'll sit in class from 8 to 4 that day, then step right into Greek that night. And I will have to replicate this on paper because we always had quizzes. And I remember crying at 2:00 in the morning where I'm about halfway through the degree thinking, Lord, why in the world am I doing this? Now, a beautiful thing is just about a year ago, there was a moment in time when I was allowed to be in a certain space with some individuals, and it was just a pivotal moment in time. And I'm on the front row for this moment, literally on the front row. And it was like the Lord reminded me and said, Kate, this is why you did Greek at 2:00 in the morning. This was why. And it wasn't that because I knew Greek, I was in that room, right? It was because I had done the work. It had opened doors for me to be in that room. It wasn't so much about Greek. And I thought it was so beautiful that I did graduate in 2008. And that it was as strong a prompting, this is why you did Greek at 2:00 in the morning, as it was when I Googled, what does it take to be a chaplain? And I said, yep, I'm going to do it. So it is very sweet that God brought that back to my mind. But it did cost me something. And I don't know if we'll talk about that later in terms of just relationship and availability and things like that. But I don't regret doing it.
Like Marie said, I think a lot of people wish they could go back to college or further their education or start over. But when faced with all the things you actually have to do, people just kind of succumb to the status quo and just keep plugging along where they are. I think you said your motivation was obedience to God. No, I'm going to have to obey sooner or later. So what would you say to people that are feeling stuck and just are afraid to make that first step?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I often like to talk about is 10 years from now, you're going to be somewhere. So 10 years are going to come and go, and you'll either move closer to the goal that you have or you'll be right where you are. And so it doesn't just automatically happen that you get the degree. There are all these steps that you have to take. So if you can do something that moves you in that direction. When I first started, I had been really good as an undergraduate. Now, remember, I had no children at that time. So I took 21 hours every semester and graduated pretty quickly with an undergraduate. So I took that same approach when I started my master's. And after one semester, I was like, oh, Lord, what have I done? Wow. Because I did not think about having to cook dinner every night, and the laundry was still my responsibility. And I did have 2 kids who were coming into about to be teenagers. And we were running our own nonprofit counseling organization. And I was in charge of all of the pre-work for all of our clients. And I remember there was one moment in classes, again, I was about halfway through, and the university began offering a Master's of Theological Studies, which they did not offer when I started. And it was half this hours. My master's was 82 graduate hours. The Master's of Theological Studies was around 40. And I remember when the professors came in the room to say, if anybody wants to change and go to the MTS, this is the time to do it. And I thought, oh my gosh, I could be done. I could be done. And something in me thought, don't you do it, girl. Don't you do it. Don't you do it. And multiple people in the class, no judgment, decided to do it because it was an exhausting program. And I realize now that, again, I trusted my gut on that, my spiritual instincts, because I wouldn't have been able to have gotten my doctorate with the master's in theological studies that would open the door to the work that I'm doing now, which makes perfect sense for the training that I have. And so to answer your question, Julie, is starting small, taking one class. Even I often say to our students that education is not tethered to credit hours. So if you feel a prompting that you're being drawn in a direction, begin to devour books on that subject until you can get into school and begin to get some more hours. I would say the biggest thing that you need is the support of your family. It's one thing for you to think that's what you're supposed to do, but if everybody else does not support you, that might be a little bit harder, because I could not have done it if my husband didn't jump in and help with the kids, since we were homeschooling. I couldn't have done it if my kids were not okay eating roast beef out of the crock pot twice a week, which, by the way, I have one child who's a vegetarian, but the other is not. And he asks his wife not to make roast beef or beef stew because evidently that's all I cooked for 5 years. And to this day, he will not eat roast beef and beef stew. So there are some scars remaining from mom's education. But yeah, that would be my answer. 10 years are going to come and go. You're either closer to your goal or you're not, and you're in charge of that. So what can you do to just slowly get closer to that goal?
Yeah, that sounds like good advice.
How long do you think that you wrestled with this decision? Like, you thought you might want to go on for your master's, and then how long was it before you started? 2 weeks? 6 months?
No.
A year?
Well, I mean, it works on, you're on semesters. I will tell you that one thing that my bio doesn't read is that because my husband's a therapist and I was having a lot of conversations with clients, it felt a little bit like a natural fit for me to get a master's in counseling. And some people still think that's what I have, and that's not what I got. And so for a couple of years, I thought that might be what it needed to be, but I was really specific about saying, Lord, is this what I'm supposed to do? And sort of going back and forth. And when Gideon laid out his fleece, and for a couple of years, I felt like I was going back to school, but I was pretty convinced it was a master's in counseling, and those doors just never seemed to line up. And I remember I'd really prayed about it for 2 years. This is a really unique story. Most people do not know this story, so it might sound really foreign. And so after 2 years, honestly, I got tired of praying about, Lord, I think I'm supposed to go back to school, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And then I found the chaplaincy, but I still wanted to make sure that I had found the right thing. And so it was, I think, the middle of the summer that I was thinking, okay, we won't do counseling, although I've prayed about this for 2 years. We'll do chaplaincy, but Lord, you got to make it really clear here. And so I remember saying, my birthday is January the 10th and my anniversary is January the 16th. So here's the deal, Lord. Now I'm praying this in the middle of the summer. I'm going to need it to snow on one of those 2 days. Now it sounds like that's normal. It snows in January. Well, around here, it doesn't snow in January anymore like it used to. So January, I don't tell anybody that this is what I've prayed. And I continue to remind God, okay, God, here's the deal. If I'm going back to school this year, 2004, I'm going to need it to snow on my birthday or on my anniversary. And so, I mean, I was just tired of trying to figure this out, right? I needed an answer on this one specific thing. And so January 10th comes and goes and it doesn't snow. I said, Lord, this is it. I'm not going to ask this again for another year. So January 16th, if it doesn't snow, I'm going to wait a whole nother year before I go back to school. And we'll keep asking and we'll do this dance some more. So January 16th is a Sunday on that year. It's like 55 degrees, no joke, when we go to church. We get to church, we go in, we come out, the temperature has dropped 20 degrees.
Wow.
On the way home from the back seat, one of my children goes, "It's snowing." And I looked out the window and it's barely snowing. I said, "Oh Lord, you're going to have to do better than that." And my husband looks at me and goes, "Kate, is that what you prayed?" We get home and within an hour, there are 2 inches of snow. The lady, Lisa Patton, if anybody's from around here, Lisa Patton comes on the news and says, we don't know where the snow came from. I started jumping up and down in my living room going, it was for me. It was for me. So I remember the day it snowed. And the beauty of that story is that when it got really hard and I was like, I don't know, God, this is too hard. One of my kids or my husband would say, it snowed. My very last class was Hebrew. I went into class that night, and when I came out after class was over, there were 3 inches of snow on my car, and I had not even thought about the snow story at that point. I'm trying to get done with school. I've been doing that dance for 5 years just for my master's. I called home, and my son said, Mom, it snowed for you to start, and it snowed for you to stop.
Aww.
So there are all these sacred stories that are woven in my narrative where there would be reminders of, nope, we're doing this thing. So yes, there was a 2-year wrestling, and it wasn't, I knew I was going back to school. So that wasn't up for question. What was for question is what in the world I was going to do. And what sounded like it made sense was counseling. But when I landed on chaplaincy, that made my soul go, yes. And so then it snowed.
I think what often happens is we can get stuck in that dreaming phase. It's so fun to research. It's so fun to think, oh, well, I could go here or there, or, well, what exactly do I want to do? Or let me see the road completely laid out before me. But before we ever do something like you did, you're going to have to take a little bit of stepping out where you don't know the outcome.
Well, people would ask me all the time, what are you going to do? And for the longest, I did say, well, I want to be a chaplain. And then I graduated in 2008. And if you remember 2008, they are not hiring women, much less women with ministry degrees. And we had this nonprofit counseling ministry, and we are eating grass shavings up from underneath the mower because nobody can pay for counseling in 2008. And so I remember I ended up working at the mall for 2 years. That's a whole nother story that I don't think is in my bio because it's the only job that I could find. And I remember saying, Lord, we had a deal. Like I was going to do this work. I did Greek at 2:00 in the morning, and you were going to give me the job that I wanted. And the reason I ended up going back and getting my doctorate is I really couldn't find a job in ministry. And my sweet husband said, hang on, you want to get another job where you want to get another degree where you can't find a job? And I'm like, yeah, I think I'm supposed to. And he's like, okay, I support you. Let's do this thing. So it was all blind faith. It was all knowing that God was up to something, but me writing a script for what God was doing was not going to be helpful because I had no idea really how it was going to play out. And so learning to just walk in that. And again, it's family support. If my husband had not said, I support you in this, then it would have been an impossible task. It would have been impossible.
I love hearing your story, Kate, so much. I know that one of the thoughts that I had was I would love to know your feelings, especially with your journey with the Lord. I think that interests me the most. And knowing that you made the sacrifices, that it took you 5 years to complete your master's and then to not be able to get a job. I know you kind of breezed over that, but can you go back and just explain how did you handle that? Because you expect, like you said, all right, Lord, we had this conversation. I followed you in faith and it didn't work out. Like I've sacrificed for 5 years. My family sacrificed for 5 years. I feel like that would bring me to somewhat of a crisis of belief.
I love the opportunity to answer that question. Thank you for asking that. So what happened was when I went to Lipscomb to inquire about the Masters of Divinity, the dean at the time looked at me and he said, a Masters of Divinity will get you any job in ministry that you want. So I went through the whole 5 years with that tape playing over and over. I'm going to get any job I want. He said, right? He's Dr. So-and-so and he knows. And when I got out in 2008 and we were busy, we had a lot of clients. It wasn't that my husband wasn't able to see clients. It was that nobody was able to pay. So there were not many job openings. I applied for a couple in ministry, and in most of the positions, I was more qualified than the person that was going to be over me. I just wasn't getting opportunities. And I remember specifically saying, Lord, I am going to just cast my net, and whatever you put in my net, I'm going to do it. I don't even need to be able to discern right now because I'm so frustrated. So whatever gets in my net, I'm going to trust.
Okay.
One thing jumped in my net. and it was working at the mall at a jewelry store making $8.25 an hour. And I specifically remember a customer coming to the counter after I was working there and was about to start my doctorate. And the customer said, I plan to apply to work at this jewelry store, but I'll be in management. I said, oh, really? Tell me about that. And she goes, well, I have a college degree. And I thought, oh, Lord, this is an opportunity to keep my mouth shut. And I said, oh, well, great. Well, I encourage you to apply. I hope to see your resume. Thanks so much for coming in. And I'm sure I thought, ah! But what really happened was every day I was in a bad mood. I was in a bad mood for 2 years. I loved the job because it was fun. But I did feel cheated by the dean of the university, and I sort of felt a little bit forgotten by God. And I remember one morning, again, lamenting, saying, Lord, this was not the deal. And much like I saw the snow, I felt like the Lord said, you know what, Kate, I'm not nearly as concerned about kingdom jobs. You say you want a ministry job or a kingdom job. I'm not nearly as concerned about kingdom jobs as I am about kingdom living. So if you'll get busy allowing me to use you where you are, we can talk about something else later. And I thought, oh, I got that, Lord. Right. So I showed up that day, and there was a gentleman that I was working with who was in his mid-60s who had done really well in real estate. And on this very day, he said, Kate, would you remind me what your master's is in? Because I didn't broadcast that much. I said, oh, I've got a master's of divinity. And he was familiar with that. And he said, aren't you really mad that you're working at the mall? And I've said, oh, I really think God is much more concerned about kingdom living than he is about kingdom jobs. Right? I just pulled that out of my hat. Right. But then what ended up happening was one of my coworkers, her son OD'd. And she called me at 11 o'clock one night when she was on the way to Vanderbilt. And she said, don't tell anybody, but I'm headed to Vanderbilt. And so I met her there. There was another coworker whose husband was dying of cancer, and I knew that I wanted to go and see him, and he was already in hospice, and I was trying to plan it just around work, and I was already working on my doctorate at the time, and I showed up in hospice and knocked on the door, and she opened the door and she said, okay, we thought you were the chaplain. He just died, and no one knows. Would you come in and pray over him? And so I walked into his hospice room, and he had just passed, literally breathed his last breath. And I laid my hands on him and prayed over him and prayed over his family. And God said, Kate, you're being my chaplain. I need you to continue to do what it is I've asked you to do where I've placed you. And if you're faithful with a little, we'll do a little bit more. So it really did take a Holy Spirit shaking to say, this really has never been about you. It's never been about the work that you invested. It's always been about the invitation that I'm laying before you. And I need you to pay attention to the invitation. So yeah, this. It was, but I was in a bad mood for 2 years.
Well, I mean, following
God
the
and
Lord,
I were in a fight for 2 years.
Sure, I totally get that, and I love that you're telling our listeners that you're being very frank with us about it, because following the Lord is not always A plus B equals C, and it's it's not a direct shot. It's not the cause and effect, the certainties that you think, and certainly when it comes to timing, the Lord's timing is never our timing. But the practical side of you being a wife, a mom, a friend, I would love to talk about what it took for you to actually accomplish this. Did you consider any of the sacrifices that would have to be made with, first of all, your marriage, as a mom, things that maybe you used to do for fun when you had something called free time?
Yeah. So here's the answer to that question. I became bad at everything except being a student. Okay. So I was a really good student. But I was no longer cooking. I was no longer cleaning. I was no longer, and this is real, right? I no longer had this downtime to have this beautiful dialogue with my husband. I wasn't able to do fun things with my children anymore. The first thing that fell by the wayside was opportunities with friends and going and doing and being fully present for them. And because we taught Sunday school at the time, so you always had someone who had a marriage in crisis or a teenager in crisis. And Larry and I were always there to swoop in and to be fully present. And we stepped away from teaching Sunday school. And did I count the cost? Absolutely not. I just thought, Lord, if I step out in obedience, it's going to be okay. Ultimately, it was okay, but it was really, really hard. I always tell my students that if I could hear their prayers, I would probably hear them say, "Oh Lord, I just want to be like you." And what we're really saying is, I want to be like the resurrected Christ, right? I want to walk in this victory, and I want to love well, and I want to invite others into the kingdom. But what we always forget is we cannot get to resurrection unless we first go through crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of this was a part of my crucifixion, and I didn't know it at the time. So it cost me relationships. It cost me conversations. My husband and I did not do dates anymore. We used to do this great, every week we did a date night. We didn't do that anymore. I wept and cried and so many times said to my husband, "Oh, I can't do it." And he was like, "Nope, we're invested. We're doing it." I remember one day, again, my kids were preteens when I started, and about when my son hit maybe 13 or 14 and hormones start raging through the body and things start happening, and it's just horrible. I have no idea why that was God's plan, but I came home one night from class, and he had just had a bad day and had been disrespectful and just, nothing that was not out of the norm, but I didn't have the energy to deal with it. And I remember walking into his bedroom and I said, "Okay, that's it. I'm going to quit school," because in my mind, the changes in his behavior were related to the changes in my availability. And he had been snarky and smart aleck up to that point, and was sitting on the floor when I said it. And he stood up and looked me square in the eye, just in a posture almost of authority. And he goes, "You absolutely will not quit school. You have worked way too hard, Mom." And I said, "All right, you better pull it together." Now, he didn't pull it together then. He pulled it together about age 25. But the point of the story was, it was almost as if God allowed the voice of God to come through my boy saying, we're not doing this. We are not jumping ship. And so I heard that and I paid attention to it. But another great sacrifice was my daughter went on a mother-daughter mission trip to Japan for 2 weeks. And every mother went except for me, because it was the middle of the summer and I was doing Greek, and I was going to have to miss way too much Greek. If you miss one Greek day, you're pretty much in trouble. If you miss 2 Greek days, you're going to have to drop the course and pick it up. And it was not going to be offered again in a manner that I needed to be offered to continue with my coursework. And so I had to send my daughter to Japan to do all this incredible work with my best friend and her best friend. And that was a price that I had to pay. And I still regret not being able to go. I still don't know what I could have done differently. So yeah, there was a lot of sacrifice, and I laugh and say I'm still tired, but it did set me up for the rhythm that I'm in now, where I go to work every day, and I do get up at 3:30 to work out, and I get to work by about 6:15. Nobody requires that of me. It's just what I need to do for the rhythms that I've established. And I'm so far removed from the days of reading scripture every day on the couch to my children. And my husband is now fully retired, so he's home full time and I'm gone full time. And for almost 25 years of our marriage, we were together all 7 days a week, and it worked beautifully. So there are still sacrifices for being obedient. If I'd said no, I would not be doing what I'm doing now, which I love. But even now with my grandchildren, I have 3 grandchildren who live locally, and I think, wow, I could be taking them to dance lessons, or I could be filling in on the days that their mom is going to school, and I'm not able to do any of that. But I'm confident that just as it snowed and God has set this path in front of me that now makes perfect sense, that I'm where I'm supposed to be, and it's always going to cost you something to walk in obedience. Does that answer your question? That was a long story.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, thank you for sharing. I love hearing your heart about, first of all, what you felt God calling you to, but also for all of us to hear just the dailiness of what you lived. You really gave us a snapshot of the things that you were facing. And I think that is very encouraging and also very telling of the sacrifices that you made. So thank you for going into that.
Yeah. And it sounds like
Absolutely.
there were
Thank you
times
for
when
letting-
you wanted to throw in the towel, but it was family that really kept you from doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a really
Absolutely.
important part of it.
People will ask me before, for a while, I was the academic director for the doctorate of ministry, and they would say, "What do I need to know?" And I would say, if your spouse does not fully support you in this is not the season for this, because your marriage will not survive it. I mean, statistically, this is horrible to say, but whether it's PhD or doctorate of ministry, the rate at which people get divorced after, seeking post-secondary education is pretty high. So So if your family is not all on board, then I would invite you to be still and trust that prompting is right, but the time might not be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, when you said that, I'm remembering my own husband went back to get his law degree over the course of 4 years at night. And he started out 2 nights a week and then was 3 nights a week. And I feel like the last semester was like 4 nights a week, but maybe it was 3 nights of classes and 1 night of meeting with a study group. But I just remember many nights, being home alone with the kids while he's at school. And, we had 5 little kids at the time, and cooking dinner on your own and arranging carpools for sports and all of that. I mean, you're not going to be able to do that without a spouse holding things together at home or supporting you, because you, even as a student, get discouraged. You feel like, oh, I put in all this time and I don't think I really did very well on that test, or I don't think I'm going to get a very good grade, or I feel guilty for missing this. Should I even keep going? And it's the spouse that's not in school that really needs to say, no, we have invested. You can do it. We're okay. And I really think that that's required.
I agree. And if you have children and you don't have a spouse, if there's extended family that can step in and do that for you. But I think it's impossible if it's just you by yourself and you have a family. I really do.
Well, why don't you tell us what you're actually doing in your career now? You sort of alluded to earlier in the podcast that you are not exactly a chaplain. So what are you doing?
Yeah, so I just really believe that I have the coolest job at Lipscomb University. So I do get to teach Bible courses. I love to do that. I'm a faculty member in the Bible department, which is just extra fun. And then I also direct a program that's called the Life Program, and it stands for the Lipscomb Initiative for Education. And it's a program where women who are incarcerated at the Tennessee Prison for Women become official Lipscomb students. They have to have a high school degree or their HiSET, which is the new GED, and they have to take a mock ACT test, sort of an abbreviated ACT test, and they become traditional Lipscomb students. And every Wednesday night for the last 12 years, traditional students who go to the other campus in Green Hills drive to the Tennessee Prison for Women, take classes inside the women's prison along with their classmates who happen to be incarcerated. So currently we offer an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, and we even offer a master's degree. And I'm going to say this with a little bit of joy. It is the only master's degree for women in a prison in the country. We just started that 2 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So my daughter said to me one day, my grandfather used to be the sheriff of Williamson County. It was sort of back in the Andy Griffith days in Franklin, Tennessee, if you have watched Andy Griffith. And my grandmother was the one who would bake the food when the people got arrested. Now, if you landed in the local jail back then, you had a 1 or 2 night stay, literally like Andy Griffith. And so the rumor around town, that's right, she was Aunt B. The rumor around town was that people would try to get arrested so they could eat Miss Lucille's homemade rolls.
Oh, wow.
And one day, my daughter said to me, Mom, you're just offering bread to people who are hungry, just like your grandmama did. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is so deeply profound. And so I direct that program. I run the associates and the bachelor's and then the master's degree. And it's incredible. And I will add that we have gotten a grant, and we are next semester doubling the size of the program. And we're going to the men's prison as well.
Oh, wow.
There's a verse at the end of, after Mary, it's in Matthew, and it's when Mary goes to the tomb and she finds the tomb empty. And she leaves the tomb, and it describes Mary as feeling afraid yet filled with joy, right? She's terrified. Where is the body of this Jesus that she loves so deeply? But yet something in her knows, oh, this is really good. And I always say I live in that kingdom dichotomy for what I've been invited to do. I'm constantly afraid. Lord, are you sure I'm the one? Lord, are you sure that this is what I'm really tasked with? Are you sure I'm good enough for this? And always with that sense of, oh, this is going to be so good, God. And so one of the things it does is it keeps you really humble if you know that you're always working with people that are smarter than you, probably more educated, and yet the sense that you know you did the work, you just didn't know where it was going. So you knew that this has to be God. There's a really sweet story I can share with you too, if you want to hear it, about how I ended up becoming the director of the program, which again is confirming for me as the snow was. So
sure, yes, please tell us.
So when I was working on my master's, it was 2007, and there was a little article that came out in a Lipscomb magazine that's called Lipscomb Now. And the article was probably 6 inches tall, and it described a program that they were starting at the prison where women at the prison would be students along with traditional students. And I remember the way I describe it is it was like something leapt inside of me, much like John the Baptist leapt in the belly of Elizabeth. It was that kind of feeling. And so on that day, I started saying, Lord, if there's ever any way that I can be a part of this, please let me be a part of it. So whenever I would hear about it on campus, whenever I would read anything about it, see anything on TV, anything, I would always pray the same prayer. Lord, if there's ever any way I can be a part of this, please let me be a part of it. So I finished my master's, worked at the mall, was working on my doctorate, and was just about finished with my doctorate, and was hired again, an opportunity to be humble on campus as a temporary administrative assistant. Now, I remember the person that hired me said, now just know this is a temporary position. There's no guarantee that you're actually going to be the administrative assistant. Now, administrative assistants run the university, so I'm not talking negatively about them. But again, I'm 4 months away from finishing my doctorate, and this is the job that I have. And my husband said to me, do you want to work at Lipscomb? And I said, yeah, babe, but this is not what I went to school to do. And he goes, do you want to work there? And I said, yes. He goes, get up there. He said, if they ask you to cut the grass with scissors, do it. It won't take them long to figure out who you are. And within 6 months, I was an adjunct. And then pretty quickly, God just moved me through, and it was very cool. But one day in 2014, again, I'd finished my doctorate at the time. The director of the program showed up in my office, and I turned around and I saw him, and I had always idolized him from afar. I sort of have this personality where if I think something needs to happen, I can find the person who knows the person to send the email, to knock on the door, whatever, can usually make something happen. But for some reason around the Life program, I never felt a prompting to drive this to become reality. I just prayed every time, Lord, if there's ever any way I can be a part of it, please let me be a part of it. So 2014, the founder, Dr. Richard Good, showed up in my office, and I didn't even know he knew I was alive. And he said, hey, I have 2 questions for you. I said, okay. He said, tell me what you did your dissertation on. And I told him. He said, second question is, would you ever be willing to teach at the Life program? And I gasped so audibly that this kind, beautiful, brilliant, gracious man jumped because he just didn't know my personality. And he goes, whoa, I'm so sorry. You don't have to answer that right now. I said, no, you don't understand. I said, ever since that article came out, and he paused and he goes, that would be 2007. That was 7 years ago. I said, okay. So for 7 years, I have been asking God if there's ever any way that I can be a part of this, to please let me be a part of it. Today is not the day for me to pray about your invitation. Today is the answer to that prayer.
Oh, awesome.
And so he asked me to teach biblical ethics. I did it, and then I kept doing it, and then I stuck around. And even when I wasn't teaching, I kept going out to the prison every Wednesday night. And several years later, he showed up in my office with my direct report at the time and my dean. And I said to them, what is the Trinity doing in my office? And the founder said, Kate, I'm giving up the Life program, and I would like for you to take it. And I just wept, just almost in the floor. And I said, this is not what I prayed. And he said, you have no idea what you prayed. And so again, I directed, and on the days where I think, Lord, you called the wrong one, God says, no, Kate, we prayed about this for 7 years. We prayed about it for 7 years. You're not the wrong one. This is your season. So again, a reminder that Greek at 2:00 in the morning, I don't remember the 24 ways to write the Greek word thee, but sometimes you have to do the work to get where God is taking you. It's not that it's going to perfectly align. It's just that the work will open the doors. And so I'm so honored to be a part of that program and so thankful, just humbled to do the work. And we always find that when we go to the prison, all are teacher and all are learner, that there's sort of this unwritten assumption that we're bringing them something and we have something to offer. But we find really, really quickly that they have narratives and stories and faith in God that is so surpasses what I believe about God in powerful ways. And so I've learned way more than I've given out there. I'm quite confident of that.
That's amazing.
Yeah, really awesome. Very inspiring. What would you say to somebody who's listened to all of these wonderful things that have lined up in your life? What would you say to them if they're contemplating a career change in midlife? Do you have any words of encouragement or advice?
You know, I often say that what I've realized I'm still trying to do is just pass out a cup of cold water, right? I'm still trying to get back to that 13-year-old candy striper who's just offering something. And at 13, didn't know I was doing that in Jesus' name. So I think that sometimes we can even recycle our memories from childhood and say, what was it that was life-giving to me? What brought me joy? What made me come alive? What seemed to spark something in me? And we can sort of see where God began to do a work there. You can even spend some time just reflecting on who you were as a child, because life happens and the laundry piles up and bills come in and those have to be paid. And those are paramount, and husbands and partners and all of those people need things from you. And we get lost in who we are. So discovering who you were, sort of going back to those spaces and saying, all right, Lord, what were you inviting me to then that you're now bringing back up that I can pay attention to? And spend some time asking those questions, and then see what God might be showing you. And then I often think about what David said to Solomon, right? David wanted to build the temple and God said, nope, you're not going to be the one that builds it. It's going to be your boy. And I remember the verse where David just looks at Solomon and says, just do the work. Just simply just do the work, right? There's work to be done. And again, as we talked about, it took a lot of work and it took a lot of sacrifice. Do I regret it? No, I don't regret it at all. I think that I wrote a script for myself, and my script did not play out perfectly. However, I do remember one night in the halls of the prison where I had an opportunity, not as a director, I was just a volunteer, to pray over a woman. And the founder of the program said, Kate, you're our chaplain. Now, he never knew that I went to school to be a chaplain. And I thought, Lord, you've allowed him to name me. And that's really been you naming me. And I think that God started waking that up in me at 13. So pay attention to what you desired as a child. I think those are our truest intentions.
Yeah.
That's interesting,
Is that
because we've
helpful?
actually talked about that before.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Like in the middle years, you do kind of forget who you are. You're meeting everybody else's needs, and you just kind of forget who you are. And going back to those early years, you know, what sparked joy, what interested you, what made you happy, that's important, because it hasn't changed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us today, Kate. I can't help but feel inspired, and I'm sure that many of our listeners will too. I think it was excellent to hear the way God's worked in your life. Now, before we go, we have to do our I'm a Fan segment, and I just can't wait to hear what you're a fan of.
This is what I'm a fan of, and this is something that everybody has access to, and it won't cost you any money. So one of the things that I do in my class, I talk about how that we're so busy, and especially for moms, if that's your target audience, we're so busy doing that it's almost like our souls are stirred up creek water, right? If you ever walked in a creek, or you've walked in a river, or you've stepped into a lake and it gets all muddy because you've stirred up the silt underneath. And that really what we need is we need to be able to find spaces where we can sit and let the silt settle. So this semester, what I did is I walked down to the creek and I scooped up a big old jar of creek water, complete with silt. And every class period, I take this jar into my classroom and I stir it up and remind our students that when we are so busy and living such a frenetic pace that we cannot discern, we cannot hear, and we cannot be fully present to God because we've muddied the water. Some of the things we've muddied the water with are really good things. Some of the things we've muddied the water with because we've been, it's made us feel good to be asked to do something. We like to be needed. And so the motive there is really we're trying to fill a hole that seems to be insatiable, right? And yet, if we will be still and let the silt settle, we'll be able to tend to the invitations of God. And so I had a student come by the other day and she's like, Dr. Watkins, I need to borrow the jar. I'm like, what are we borrowing the jar for? And she goes, I'm doing an object lesson in another class and I want the jar. Another colleague came by and said, Kate, I've got to have a jar. You could sell these things. So I made him a jar. And I'm thinking, this jar of creek water is sending reminders to people that it costs you something if you do not sit and tend to God. And as a mom, it sounds like, when am I going to find the time? But that can even be, St. Teresa of Avila would say that God walks among the pots and pans, that you can even find something in your day that you hate and remind yourself that it's sacred because you do it in the presence of God. For example, when you wash the dishes, that can be when you pray. When you fold the laundry, that's when you can be silent. Finding so that you're not adding one more thing to your day, because who has time for that? But taking something that's normal and reminding yourself that it's sacred because you do it with God. And the jar of silt that sits on my desk is now the thing that reminds me of that. So I bet nobody said that.
No one has ever said that they are a fan of creek water, but you make it sound so romantic. I want to get a jar of creek water.
Now I can't say what my favorite is.
Well, we don't all have Masters of Divinity, so we don't have to live
Exactly.
up to that. All right, Mindy, I'm curious. What are you a fan of?
All right. So when you're headed down to the creek to get the creek water, I have a great little accessory that you can look really cute doing it.
Ooh.
Oh, I have to say that I have rediscovered my love for scarves. And so I have always, as a teenager, I was very preppy and I would tie scarves around my waist. I would put them through my jean belt loops and tuck my t-shirt in. Now I learned from my daughter that you can wear scarves tied to your purse or your tote. I went to this brand new store with my friend Katie called Made Well, and I bought 2 other scarves and I've been wearing them in my hair.
Yes.
And I realized I'm going to have to chill it with the scarves because I can't wear one in my hair, around my neck, and on my purse all at the same time. I am a huge fan of scarves. It is just a beautiful feminine accessory. So when you're down at the creek, put your scarf on.
Yes. Well, hey, it'll keep
I
you
love
from
it.
getting sunburned while you're in the water.
There you go.
Sounds like a country music song.
You know?
All right, Julie, what are you a fan of?
I'm a fan of a book right now that we're doing with the college girls at our house, and it's called Boundaries.
Oh.
And it's an old book by, is it Henry McLeod?
Cloud and Townsend. Yeah.
Yeah. I took the little test before we started, and I scored so low that I was told I needed help. I am not very good with boundaries. So I need to learn when to say no, when to say yes, and take control of my life. So
Creek
it's
water
been
will help with
really-
that, Julie.
I know. I'm getting a jar today. I just got to find a creek.
They've all dried up in Tennessee because it's been so hot.
Right.
All right. Well, what am I a fan of? I am a fan of something that's been around for several years now, but I am always such a late adopter of technology. Earlier this year, I said I love my wireless headphones, and I did. But my husband was taking a couch for a friend to the dump this weekend, and he dumped it in the dumpster, and some of it was still sticking out, and he noticed something was under the mesh. So he took out a pocket knife, and he cut it open, and he found a pair of Apple AirPods still in the case. And he called the guy and he said, "Hey, I just found some AirPods in your couch. Do you want them back?" And he goes, "I run an Airbnb. There's no way for me to tell whose those are, so you can keep them." So he called me. He goes, "Marie, do you want a pair of AirPods?" Because he already has some. And I said, "Oh, I don't know." In my mind, I'm thinking, well, I already like my current wireless headphones that were a lot cheaper. Well, it took me all of one day to try those things out. And then it took me all of about 5 minutes to see how much better they were than my other wireless headphones.
They sound better?
They sound better and they just work better.
Oh,
For one thing
wow.
I didn't like about my wireless headphones was every time someone called, I would have to find my phone, disconnect because the microphone on them was not very good. With these AirPods, you can just seamlessly start talking to the other person and they don't even know that you're on headphones.
It's good to know.
Wow.
Yeah, so if you've been on the fence about getting any wireless headphones, you might want to splurge on the AirPods because I really do think that you will enjoy them. Well, thank you so much, Kate, for coming on and talking with us. We really enjoyed it. You have such an inspiring story, and I love the work you're doing down at the prison ministry. And I would just love to hear, like, from some of your graduates. That would be so interesting.
Oh, yeah.
That would be amazing. I would love for that to happen. Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you. I'm honored to do the work. Yeah. Thanks.
All right, ladies. Well, we will talk to you next week.
All right. Sounds great. Thanks again, Kate.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye. We're so happy you joined us today. If you'd like to help us spread the word about Midlife Matters with one of our free bumper stickers, please email your name and address to midlifematterspodcast@gmail.com. Also, please tell a friend about the show and help them hit the free subscribe button on their favorite podcast app. For links to everything in today's episode, see our show notes at midlifematterspodcast.com or come and follow us on Instagram at Midlife Matters Podcast. That's where we post pictures and stories about all the things we talk about in each episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you back here next week.